This is Rummy's Corner. After Felix Trinidad scored a dramatic 12th round knockout in an absolute war of a match against Fernando Vargas, Tito was on top of the boxing world. The former unified welterweight world champion was now the unified junior middleweight world champion, and with a perfect record in 39 professional contests, Trinidad was widely viewed as one of the very best pound-for-pound boxers in the world. And the victory against Vargas was merely a prelude to Trinidad moving up to middleweight, where he was the participant in a four-man tournament which also included WBC middleweight champion Keith Holmes, WBA middleweight champion William Joppy, and IBF champion Bernard Hopkins. The winner of this tournament would produce the first undisputed middleweight champion since Marvelous Marvin Hagler, and despite the fact he had never competed in the weight class, Trinidad was widely viewed as the big favorite going in. The first matchup occurred on April 14, 2001 at Madison Square Garden in New York, New York, and this was a unification bout between WBC champion Keith Holmes and IBF champion Bernard Hopkins. At this point in time, Hopkins was the longest reigning champion of the current title holders, having already made a dozen defenses of his IBF strap, but at age 36, Hopkins was considered to be on the downside, and Keith Holmes was a highly skilled, rangy southpaw. But on this night, Hopkins still had the craft and fire to take care of business against Holmes. By the third round, Hopkins had seized command of the action, and he was the one controlling the tempo of the fight. Hopkins was consistently making a sound investment downstairs, and he rattled Holmes several times throughout the fight with sneaky shots upstairs. It was sometimes an ugly clinch-filled affair, but Hopkins handled matters in a workmanlike fashion, and he was awarded a unanimous decision for his efforts, with official scores of 118 to 109, 117 to 110, and 119 to 108. With the victory, Bernard Hopkins had just become the unified IBF WBC middleweight champion of the world. On May 12, 2001 at Madison Square Garden in New York, New York, WBA middleweight champion William Joppy put his title on the line against a unified WBA IBF junior middleweight champion, Felix Trinidad. This was Trinidad's middleweight debut, and the champion was trying to press the action and make a statement early in the contest. But once Tito got a feel for what was in front of him, he rocked Joppy with a big counter left, and Trinidad proceeded to methodically go on the attack, and he hammered the champion with a number of big, thudding shots. As the opening round was coming towards a close, Trinidad landed a flush right followed by a stinging left hook that sent Joppy down to the canvas. Joppy made it to his feet, and he appeared to be badly hurt, but he did survive the round. From that point forward, Joppy put forth a game effort, and he was fighting back the next couple of rounds with a high-volume attack, but Trinidad was still usually doing the better work. Trinidad floored Joppy again early in round 4. Joppy was quick to his feet, and he attempted battling back with everything he had, but Joppy was still having an awful lot of trouble anticipating Trinidad's power shots. Towards the end of round 5, Trinidad clubbed Joppy with two big rights that had him down again. Joppy beat the count, but he was stumbling around badly, and referee Arthur Mercanti Jr. had seen enough. Felix Trinidad had just become the new WBA middleweight champion of the world, and this set the stage for the big showdown between unified IBF WBC champion Bernard Hopkins and the newly crowned WBA champion Felix Trinidad. The final bout was originally scheduled for September 15th, but it was ultimately pushed back because of the terrorist attacks on 9/11. So instead, it was September 29th, 2001, at Madison Square Garden in New York, New York. Felix Trinidad squared off against Bernard Hopkins for the undisputed middleweight crown. Trinidad was a 4-1 favorite going into the bout, and few observers were giving the aging Hopkins much of a chance against the rising Puerto Rican superstar. Hopkins was considered ancient by many. Trinidad was widely expected to win, and there was even talk of Felix moving up to 168 to meet Roy Jones Jr. at a catchweight after he beat Hopkins. But Bernard Hopkins had other plans, and the executioner was determined to shine under the big spotlight. Things began with both champions showing one another a lot of mutual respect, and they were both looking to gauge the distance with each man attempting to establish his jab. Before long, Hopkins was utilizing very good lateral movement and excellent footwork to prevent Trinidad from discovering his range. Hopkins was also beginning to find his own range with the jab, and late in round 2, Hopkins nailed Trinidad with a stiff right hand that got Tito's attention. By round 3, Hopkins was clearly winning the battle of the jabs, and he was also expertly controlling the range and distance. Hopkins was jabbing effectively on the outside, and on the inside, he was outworking Trinidad and smothering his offense. Trinidad was sneaking in a good shot every now and again, but he was still having great difficulty establishing favorable angles. During the middle rounds, Hopkins continued controlling the range and tempo, and he also started throwing more counter rights and more lead rights with greater regularity. Trinidad was still having a lot of difficulty dealing with Hopkins' tactics, and whenever the two traded, Hopkins was almost always getting the better of the exchanges. And this basic trend would continue. Hopkins was controlling the range with his jab and footwork on the outside, and he was thoroughly outfighting Trinidad on the inside. Tito continued having some spots of success, but he couldn't build any momentum, and he could never seem to find the answer. And Trinidad was looking more and more confused as Hopkins started creating more opportunities for his right hand. By the later portions of the fight, the difference in class was now on full display. Hopkins was usually getting off first, he started putting together some really nice combinations, and by this point he was in complete command of the action. Trinidad, to his credit, he never stopped trying, and he was always giving it all he had trying to find ways to land on his slippery opponent, but it got to the point where Hopkins really started beating him up. Hopkins was winning on the outside, he was winning at mid-range, and whenever the two were trading at close quarters at this point, it was an absolute exhibit of the art of infighting on full display from Bernard Hopkins. It was an outstanding game plan, and it was executed to near perfection by the executioner. In the 12th and final round, Hopkins came out aggressively and he went on the attack. By this point, Trinidad looked physically and mentally fatigued, but he kept coming forward, and Hopkins clipped Trinidad with a perfectly timed counter right that sent Trinidad tumbling down. Felix managed to beat the count, but his corner had seen enough and they stopped the fight. Bernard Hopkins had just become the undisputed IBF, WBC, WBA middleweight champion of the world, and in doing so, he became the first undisputed middleweight champion since Marvelous Marvin Hagler, a distinction he held some 15 years earlier. From my perspective, I've always thought this was a truly incredible tournament with 4 very talented champions, and it all culminated in a classic upset for the ages. I remember absolutely loving this tournament, and I really wish this type of thing was more commonplace in boxing. Unification tournaments that result in a new undisputed champions are always a good thing, especially in a day and age with so many different alphabet trinkets. And I know we've had other tournaments since then. I enjoyed the Super 6 Boxing Classic, which culminated in the rise of Andre Ward. And more recently, I've also enjoyed the World Boxing Super Series, in particular the Cruiserweight version that recently culminated with the rise of Alexander Usyk. But I really thought that middleweight tournament in 2001 was a shining example of what these types of tournaments should be. And I really wish, as a general rule, that the powers that be at these various sanctioning bodies, I really wish they would encourage this sort of thing more often, because this was a truly great event for boxing fans. As for the victory itself, more than 17 years later after Hopkins scored the dominant upset against Trinidad, I honestly don't think Hopkins generally gets the credit he deserves. It's very common to see vocal Hopkins detractors dismiss the Trinidad victory as some meaningless win against a so-called blown-up welterweight, but that's a bunch of bullshit. Trinidad had already beaten the best guys at 154, and he absolutely destroyed a legitimate champion in William Joppy. And it's worth remembering here, Joppy continued campaigning at middleweight for years after losing to Trinidad, and Felix was the only man who ever stopped Joppy at that weight, something Hopkins himself couldn't do 2 years later. So I honestly believe there's a lot of revisionist history going on regarding Hopkins' victory against Trinidad, but make no mistake, this was a tremendous victory for Bernard Hopkins. It made huge waves across the boxing landscape of that time, and it wasn't just that Hopkins scored the big upset, but that he won in such dominant fashion with the dramatic finish that really made it something terrific. It's kind of ironic to think that people were saying that Hopkins was too old way back then and that he was ancient, but Bernard would continue to be viewed as a top 10 ranked middleweight or light heavyweight over the next 13 years after this. And that's truly an absolute marvel. In fact, no boxer in history was viewed as a top 10 contender for as long as Hopkins was. And it's amazing to think that his big breakthrough victory didn't happen until he was at an advanced age against a bona fide pound-for-pound elite. Bernard Hopkins is truly one of a kind. Thanks for watching, everyone. Hope you enjoyed, and have a great night.